Plato warned that a society that neglects education is doomed to fail. Aristotle believed that an educated population was the foundation of a just society. Socrates was executed for teaching people how to think critically. Throughout history, rulers who seek unchecked power have learned one thing: a population that cannot think for itself is a population that will not resist. When dictators and authoritarians rise to power, they do not always use brute force to control people. Sometimes, they simply take away their ability to think critically. Public education is a threat to tyranny. A dumbed-down population is easier to manipulate. This is why history is full of examples of leaders who dismantled, defunded, or reshaped education to serve their interests. A nation without access to knowledge is a nation that will accept anything it is told. This is how power is secured, not by force, but by ignorance. Stay with me as we break down 5 reasons why tyrants throughout history have attacked public education. Each one reveals how controlling knowledge is the key to controlling people. Make sure to watch until the end, because understanding these tactics is the first step in resisting them. Reason number 1. Public education creates independent thinkers. Aristotle believed that education was the foundation of a self-governing society. People who understand history can recognize when it is repeating. People who study philosophy learn how to challenge authority. People trained in logic can see through propaganda. Tyrants do not want independent thinkers. They want obedient followers and loyalists. Public education equips people with the ability to analyze the world around them. It teaches them to ask difficult questions, challenge authority, and even confront friends and family who may have already been misled. Most importantly, it helps individuals recognize when they themselves are being manipulated. For a dictator, this is a serious threat. An educated society is far harder to control. If a leader seeks to rule without resistance, he must first ensure the people lack the knowledge to resist. This is why authoritarian rulers do not invest in strengthening public education. They work hard to dismantle it. They spread lies about its failures, convincing their followers that the system is broken beyond repair and that only they have the solution. But their goal is not to fix education, it is to control it. By undermining trust in public schools, they pave the way for rewriting curriculums, restricting access to knowledge, and shaping a generation that no longer questions authority. Reason number 2. Destroying education makes people dependent on the government. Plato warned that when education is neglected, people lose the ability to govern themselves. Without knowledge, they become dependent on those who claim to have the answers. This is why many authoritarian regimes throughout history have deliberately defunded or restricted access to public education. When people cannot read well, they struggle to seek information on their own. When they do not understand history, they fail to see when leaders are repeating old mistakes. When they lack critical thinking skills, they rely entirely on the government or the ruling class to tell them what is true. And when education is dismantled, people turn to state-controlled media as their primary source of information. They absorb only what the government wants them to hear, believing they are informed when, in reality, they are being conditioned. The leader becomes the ultimate source of truth, feeding the population carefully crafted narratives designed to maintain his power. Without independent education, there is no independent thought, only obedience. History shows that this tactic is effective. In totalitarian states, newspapers, television, and even school textbooks are rewritten to serve the ruling party. Leaders are portrayed as saviors, dissenting voices are silenced, and the people, lacking the knowledge to question what they are told, accept whatever version of reality is presented to them. Public education gives people freedom of thought. Without it, they become permanently dependent on those in power, unable to distinguish truth from propaganda. Reason number 3. Indoctrination is more useful than education. Socrates believed that true education meant questioning everything. For that, he was put on trial and sentenced to death. Tyrants do not always eliminate education entirely. Sometimes they replace it with indoctrination. The Roman Empire gradually replaced philosophical education with lessons on loyalty to the emperor. Nazi Germany rewrote textbooks to create an entire generation loyal to the state. The Soviet Union controlled what information could be taught so that only government-approved ideas were allowed to exist. Public education ensures that knowledge is shared freely. A privatized or controlled education system allows those in power to decide what people learn. Instead of critical thinking, students are taught loyalty. Instead of analyzing information, they are taught to memorize and repeat. A tyrant doesn't need a thinking population. He needs followers who accept his word as truth. The shift from education to indoctrination does not happen overnight. There are warning signs. When teachers and professors are labeled as dangerous or accused of corrupting students, it is often because those in power want to control the narrative. When books start disappearing from schools and libraries, it is not about protecting society. It is about limiting what people can think about. When governments dictate what can and cannot be taught based on ideology rather than fact, education is no longer about knowledge. It becomes a tool for control. When critical thinking is dismissed as dangerous or unpatriotic, questioning authority becomes a crime. When history is rewritten to serve political interests, it is no longer the past being rewritten. It is the future being shaped. When protesters are labeled as agitators and directly threatened with arrest for opposing the leader, it is no longer just about silencing dissent. It is about making sure the people are too afraid to question anything at all. These are the early warning signs, and once they begin, they rarely stop. Reason number 4. Uneducated people are easier to manipulate. Machiavelli wrote that rulers do not need to be loved. They only need to be obeyed. An uneducated population is easier to control. If people do not understand economics, they will not see how corruption benefits the ruling class. If they do not understand science, they will believe whoever speaks with the most confidence. If they do not understand politics, they will follow whoever promises them simple solutions, no matter how unrealistic or dangerous those solutions may be. Public education ensures that every citizen has the basic knowledge needed to question authority. But when education is privatized, defunded, or restricted, knowledge becomes a privilege rather than a right. The wealthy continue to learn, while the poor are left behind. The educated gain power, while the uninformed become more dependent on those who claim to have the answers. A divided society is easier to manipulate, and the easiest way to divide it is through ignorance. Unlike in Marxist revolutions, where the working class might rise up, an authoritarian leader benefits from ensuring that the lower class never even realizes they are being exploited. At this point, society begins to resemble feudalism more than a class struggle. Instead of a working class fighting for change, the lower class functions like peasants, uneducated, obedient, and entirely dependent on the ruling elite. Just as feudal lords kept peasants illiterate to preserve their power, modern authoritarian rulers weaken education to keep the lower class permanently dependent. When people lack knowledge, they do not need to be oppressed by force. They will accept their place in society without ever questioning why it was assigned to them. Without education, social mobility disappears. The people accept their place in society not because they are forced to, but because they cannot imagine an alternative. The leader is no longer just a politician. He is the sole provider of knowledge, the unquestioned authority on reality. When education disappears, so does the ability to resist. When the people stop questioning, the powerful stop answering. Reason number 5. A leader who controls education controls the future. Plato described what happens when the people lose access to knowledge. Once education is dismantled or reshaped to serve those in power, the people become passive. They do not realize what they have lost. They stop questioning why their freedoms are disappearing. They stop asking why their leaders are so powerful. Instead, they become dependent on those who claim to have the answers, even when those answers are built on lies. And the leader never stops lying. He explains away every crisis, every failure, twisting the truth to fit his narrative. If the economy collapses, it is because of outsiders, enemies, or disloyal citizens, not because of his policies. If freedoms disappear, it is for the people's own protection. He tells them they are lucky to have him. He dazzles them with entertainment, empty promises, and grand speeches about how he alone can fix everything. He tells them he loves them, and as long as they have someone else to blame, they are happy to believe it. Public education ensures that knowledge belongs to the people, but a leader who can privatize, restrict, or rewrite education can decide what the next generation learns. He can shape reality itself. Over time, the people forget how to think for themselves. They forget that things were ever different. They have been conditioned to never blame him for anything. That would mean questioning everything they know, and that is something they have been taught never to do. When the people lose control over education, they lose control over the future. And by the time they realize it, the future is no longer theirs to shape. Authoritarian rulers do not always take power by force. Sometimes they take it by ensuring the people do not know enough to stop them. Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates all warned that a ruler who fears education is a ruler who fears the people. Public education creates independent thinkers, and independent thinkers are harder to manipulate. That is why tyrants do not just weaken education. They replace it with something more useful to them: indoctrination, dependency, and distraction. A population that cannot think critically will accept whatever they are told. A leader who controls education does not just control the present, he controls the future. The people will not resist because they will not even realize there is something to resist. Instead, they will be kept comfortable, entertained, and given an enemy to blame. And through it all, they will remain loyal to the very person who is stripping away their rights, because questioning him would mean questioning everything they have been taught. Ignorance is bliss. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, "A nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be."